on Jack Kirby's work.
Oh.
And I was just wondering if you had any insight about that.
Oh, I just did an episode on him, too, because he...
Oh, yeah.
One thing about my podcast is I do research. When I see these names keep popping me up, I go, okay, I have to talk about this guy. And Vinnie Coletta keeps popping up. Like, why does this guy keep popping up? I did a thing on him. When he was inking Jack Kirby he was doing it on his Mighty Thor run, which a lot of people consider one of Jack Kirby's high watermarks in his art career, period, because he was blowing the world out with his art. And Vinnie Coletta was famous for being real fast. Like he could do a 10-day job in 3 days. And the problem is that the way he was so fast is he would erase details in the original pencils.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and people unearthed the original pencils, and they found out that he erased whole characters and landmarks or made shadow things.
What?
Oh, yeah. And like you tell that you're erasing, and of course you tell a fan you're erasing Jack Kirby's pencils. That's like blasphemy. And the comic.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Like, how could you?
Oh, yeah.
Or better yet, how dare you?
But the irony too is that even though he was erasing details to go faster, the way he inked and the texture he did was still beautiful. And people said his Thor still looked great. Like you can see the chinks in his armor and the hair looked great. And also Sif, like her eyelashes. Like he was really great at doing female characters. Like they said that she had the eyelashes of a goddess and stuff like that. So it's a weird controversy where, yeah, he's erasing details and stuff like that. But at the same time, it's like, but the rest of the stuff still looks great. Right. But then when Kirby went to DC and did the New Gods, and Vinnie Coletta followed them once again, because the way he also got these jobs was he charged less.
Right.
But that's why he worked so much, and he did details. At that point, Kirby just couldn't stand them anymore. He got him fired off all his books.
Oh, wow.
But
yeah, because one of the things, like I said, they say terrible things about, Vince, but they never say why they don't like him. They just say, well, I love this cover, but, Vince Coletta did it again, or, they'll say, and then people just kind of like jump on, and I'm like, okay. And I guess I just could have just said, well, what is the deal? But anyway, thanks for letting me know, like, the history, man, because I've been curious about that for a long time. Like, why does everyone just hate this dude so badly,
Well, they say,
so, which brings me... Go ahead.
Well, the one thing to say, the worst thing, too, is that a lot of people, like you mentioned Mike Grail, he hated his work on Warlord to the point where he drew a gambler in the comic book that looked just like Vince Coletta, and Warlord chops his hand off for cheating him. Yeah, but he admitted after the fact that, when Vince Coletta wanted to be good, he was great. That was the worst thing about him. Was like, dude, you could be a really great inker if you would just apply yourself. But no, But he was all about making that money as opposed to, well, you could have done both, but yeah.
Well, let me ask you something. So, one of the things that do impress me about a lot of these guys that are on the Facebook page, Silver Age, sometimes they know who the inker might be, even if it isn't listed. So in terms of research, how do you find out, like, if you're a comic book fan, how do you find out who the inker might be if it isn't listed in the credits? Marvel was really great about listing stuff, but, DC and Archie Comics, not so much back in those days.
Oh, yeah.
But yet it seems like people still are able to figure out who's done the ink work. Like some, like, and I'm sure you're probably the same way. You can look at someone's art and figure out, oh yeah, well that's, that person's artwork, or, this person's artwork. So I was just curious. I mean, have you ever had a situation where you had to like dig really deep to figure out who did the inking on a particular book?
Sometimes. I mean, especially the Golden Age when no one was giving credits to any of the artists, and it was almost like an assembly line, like one person did this, one person did that, and they just moved it down the chain. So it's near impossible. But eventually, like the more prominent ones, you can tell their style, which is almost the only way they can do it. And of course, the funny part too is that even if you ask them directly, the inkers will tell you, "I can't remember. I was doing so much work at the time." I was like, "I guess I was on that book at one point. I don't know."
Right.
Because it's like,
yeah. Wow, yeah. That's pretty cool. Yeah, I guess if they're still around, and because one of the things I find out about a lot of retired animators and artists if you email them or write them, they're just like, yeah, here's how I did it, or here's who I think did it, So I know that Paul Levitz at DC Comics, who ran DC Comics for a long time, he was, I sent him a couple of emails about stuff, and he was like really helpful and was willing to, tell me anything I needed to know. So it's pretty cool if you can just actually talk to someone or call someone and they can give you some insight or a clue as to, who inked that book, or I was the artist that did ink the book. So I think that's pretty cool,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I also wanted to ask, where do you find inspiration in your subject matter?
Well, the inspiration for the whole podcast was when I finally decided to do a podcast. I looked around like, well, is anyone doing about the backgrounds of all the people that actually make the comic books? Because everyone does stuff about the stories themselves and the characters, but when you start researching the backgrounds, you find out these stories are just as interesting as the original characters, and especially when I read this book called Men of Tomorrow by Gerard Jones. And it talks about the foundation of DC and the origin of Superman and how the founder of DC, Harry Donenfeld, was a friend of Frank Costello. Who, wow. Did that name ring a bell?
We're not talking about, you said Costello, okay. I'm thinking about the actor, not
Frank Costello was one of the original heads of the 5 families of the Mafia Syndicate.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that Costello.
Yeah.
No, I'm not familiar.
And you find out that during Prohibition, Donenfeld started out doing pulps before he did the comic books. He would import Canadian pulp paper down from Canada. And guess what else was in that Canadian pulp, those shipments from Canada as well, was some good Canadian whiskey that he was helping Frank Costello smuggle over.
Oh, wow.
And you find out,
that's pretty cool.
Oh, yeah, it's stuff like that. So, yeah, I start doing research, and whenever I do, I let this, almost like the history takes me where I want to go. Like, I do research about DC, and I hear this story about Vinnie Coletta and how everyone hated him. It's like, who's Vinnie Coletta? And I do a history about Vinnie Coletta. Right. Then I heard about, Mike Grail on Warlord. I've heard about Mike Grail before he did the Green Arrow and all that other great stuff. I'd do a subject of him one day. And it just takes me where I want to go almost. There's just so much great stories just behind the scenes about how comic books were made. It's fantastic. So,
yeah, wow, that's pretty cool. That is pretty cool. I mean, I'm a huge Wonder Woman fan, and I think I've read everything Wonder Woman related, but I never heard that story about Donenfeld and the mob connection.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
That is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Go ahead. You were going to say something?
Oh, yeah, it got to a point because the other head of Jack Leibowitz. He was basically charged. Well, he made his job to clean up DC. And the last thing he had to do before he could take the company public was he had to get rid of Harry Donenfeld because he was so mob.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
And it took forever because Donenfeld personally loved the fact that he owned Superman.
Right.
Like he had a cartoon where he made where where it depicted him spanking Superman. That's how yeah.
Oh, wow. That's a little.
Oh, he was a character. It's like
freaky.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because wasn't like DC. I guess I can't say they were split into two, but like at one point, Wonder Woman was being published under one company, and Batman and Superman were being published under another. And did those companies merge?
Yeah, it was like one of the first early mergers of DC, which is a larger part of how their continuity is always messed up because. DC is essentially formed of all these different comic book companies they've acquired over the years, from Fawcett to Quality and Charlton and so forth. And it was like, I can't remember the one off the top of my head, but it was like, but Wonder Woman's where the Justice Society of America came from, which was America.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And she was, and of course, I remember reading about how when they petitioned to make her a part of the team, be the first female member, they finally did it, but she was the secretary. And they're like, what?
The secretary. I'm like, yeah. I remember that also. I heard about that as well. Yeah. And I'm like, and when they would go on an adventure, she would stay in the headquarters because she was the secretary. Yeah. I'm just like, Wonder Woman is like one of the strongest members of the team, and you're leaving her in the headquarters?
Yeah, it's great.
I'm like, that's so crazy. Yeah. That is so crazy to me. But, I really feel like... one of the reasons why they did, Crisis, in 86, was because Wonder Woman's continuity was so jacked up. I mean, if you look at Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman, I mean, hers was like the worst.
Oh.
And I'm not sure if it's gotten any better, but one of the things I did read, I have a comic book here. I can't remember the name of it right now, but one of the things I did read in that book was that, I mean, obviously DC had to do something. You had mentioned that, when they bought all these other comic book lines, I know they would place them all on a separate Earth. So, the Shazam folks were on Earth S. The Quality folks were on Earth X. The Golden Age people were on Earth 2. And the current superheroes were on Earth 1. And they said it was too confusing for readers. And so they decided, one Earth, one history. And it was also a good way for them to streamline the superheroes. Hold on, I still have a house phone, and I just hear it ringing in the background. I'm just going to stop now. Anyway, so I think it was a good way for the comic book companies to not only create an awesome story and bring in a wonderful artist like George Perez, but, streamline the superheroes, get rid of some superheroes, and have one history, one Earth. And, kill off a couple of popular heroes as well. And I think it was like one of the smartest things that DC Comics did in the 1980s. And I think, I always feel like Crisis actually put them back in the game, to a certain extent.
Oh, it was definitely one of the big points of that area, because that was also once again around the 1985-86, which there's a strong argument that 1986 was arguably the greatest year of comic books in America, at least. Because that's the year that Dark Knight Returns was out, the Watchmen, Batman Year One was getting started up. You had Daredevil Born Again, Crisis of the Earth was tying up. It was like, oh wow, what a time to be alive and be a comic book fan.
Right, and so I mentioned 1986, but it actually started in 85.
Yeah, it was meant to be tied in with their 50th anniversary.
Oh, okay, okay. Oh, that's cool.
And
wow.
And also they were a little mad because Marvel jumped the gun into that Secret Wars the year before.
Oh, okay.
But the joke is that have you ever read Secret Wars at Marvel?
No, not really.
The art is good, but the joke is that when they made Crisis, okay, we're going to do Secret Wars, only that it's going to be good. Because the story was not anything to write home about. Okay, I mean, the best you got out of Secret Wars was that you got the black symbiote suit for Spider-Man. And, of course, they led to Venom and everything like that. But outside.
Right. Yeah, so like when I read that X-Men book, and that was called Crossroads, and it was written by Chris Claremont.
Oh, yeah.
Who's like one of my favorites before I stopped reading comic books the first time. And there's a scene where Rogue is talking to Kitty Pryde, and they're mentioning something about. So I guess the guy from Secret Wars, the Beyonder, was that his name?
Yes.
Okay, the Beyonder had wiped out Colossus's sister.
Oh yeah.
Ileana,
yeah.
I believe was her name.
Ileana.
And there's a really funny scene in the book where Kitty Pryde still remembered that continuity and remembered that Colossus had a sister. But there's like a really funny line that Chris Claremont writes for Rogue, and she's saying to Kitty Pryde, "What are you talking about? Colossus ain't got no sister," And every time I would read that line, I would go back and reread the book, but every time I would read that line, it would just make me laugh every time, because I could hear. I love the way that Chris Claremont crafted her dialogue, Rogue's dialogue, and her language, so that you knew exactly how she said it, and I thought that was really interesting because, comic books in the 60s and 70s didn't do that at all. There wasn't even any attempt to craft the dialogue so that you know, if someone had an accent, a Southern accent, you know, they would write it exactly how it should be pronounced. So I always thought that was a nice touch too. But that's about all I know about the Beyonder, because like I said, I had jumped into comic books back in, and that was like one of the stories that my wife Joy had. And